Priestley was a socialist, and I began by wondering how to define socialism, and then had a moment of inspiration. So what I've done here is I've gone to the 1945 Labour Party Manifesto. This is what they used to win their landslide victory. To understand how remarkable this was, you have to remember that Churchill was a conservative, and he just led Britain to the greatest triumph. They were staring defeat in the face, convinced that Germany might win this war, and amazingly we survived it. And Churchill was seen by many as the architect of this. So how could a country with a Conservative Prime Minister that had just won this amazing battle in the face of certain defeat, how could they suddenly reject such a wonderful Prime Minister and vote Labour? Well, one clue is this: the focus on the people. The people will have won both struggles, and that's the struggle in the East against Japan and against the Nazis. So the Labour Party credited not the politicians and the leaders, but the people themselves who have risen up in a united way to defeat a common enemy. And it's easy for you to see how this is a theme in An Inspector Calls. That's what the inspector means by the millions of John Smiths and the millions of Eva Smiths. They are the people. And that's what he means by fire and blood and anguish, that lesson that the ruling classes will learn, because he's talking about how the people will triumph in war and bloodshed and then reject the ruling classes. And what's interesting is he's predicting that before it's happened. He's writing the play before the Labour Party victory, but only just before. So this reading of the play sees it as a statement of political intent. It's trying to persuade the audience that they ought to vote Labour and change society for the better, as Priestley sees it. The Labour Party also focuses on the people in the factories, and this is a theme that you'll recognise from Eva. She represents all the female factory workers, and that's an audience that the Labour Party is particularly concerned with. You can imagine the enormous number of people working on the war effort, manufacturing weapons and planes, ships, anything for defence. And they're doing it for this reason: a happier future than face so many of them after the last war. And it's interesting, isn't it, that the manifesto itself is talking about the interwar years and the lesson that the country should have learnt from the First World War. So this is exactly the theme of An Inspector Calls. It's as though the play is a dramatised way of taking this Labour Party manifesto and making it real, putting flesh on it, putting it on stage. And then in red here you'll notice this Christian language that I've highlighted. Labour regards their welfare as a sacred trust. And so this idea of socialism is welfare, looking after people, and the idea of sacred brings us back to this Christian ideal, the one that Priestley uses when he gets the inspector to say, "We are all of one body," using that language of the creed to show us that that responsibility we have towards each other isn't just a political Labour Party policy. They're taking it from a Christian way of life. In other words, if you are a Christian, and most people in Britain in 1945 were, then your only logical alternative is to vote Labour, because Labour's policies are the same, if you like, as Jesus's would have been. And that's quite a powerful argument. We can also see in the manifesto this idea of women taking a much greater role. So this war will have been won by its people. People, of course, includes men and women, it's all people. And not by any one man or set of men. So it's hinting at an almost feminine perspective here, or a feminist perspective, where women have to be respected just as much as men. they've sacrificed just as much in the war effort and have been just as much victims of the Blitz and bombing. This is picked up on in the play because Priestley insists that Sheila is the person most likely to change the future. She is the one who's most in tune with the inspector, and she's also the one who's not committed a crime like Eric has. The tragedy of the play is that the interwar years were wasted. So from 1918 to 1939, women did not gain this power that had been promised. But in the Manifesto here of 1945, this movement towards celebrating women's roles is much greater. Next, the Manifesto lays out the reasons why Britain failed during the interwar years to reach its promise. Let's see how he does this, or how the Manifesto does this. The people made tremendous efforts to win the last war also, but when they had won it, they lacked a lively interest in the social and economic problems of peace. And this idea of lively interest is in fact what you get with a play. Priestley is trying to generate this lively interest. And like the Labour Manifesto, he's focusing on the people, not just on men. So hope is also with women. And what he's trying to get is the same thing as the Labour Party, a social and economic peace. For the economic peace, we have to get rid of the ruling classes, or at least the influence of the ruling classes. Let's see what the Manifesto said is the problem. So the hard-faced men who had done well out of the war is here our first accusation. So your Burlings and your Crofts in 1912 are uniquely positioned when war comes out in 1914 to make the weapons that Britain needs, and they have made tremendous profits out of it. In other words, for the rich, it's in their interests to have a Second World War because they imagine getting just as rich again. It's quite interesting, isn't it? And then look at this quotation. The hard-faced men is exactly the sort of language that Priestley uses when he gets Burling to say hard-headed men of business, like himself. It's really powerful that this language is echoed in the Manifesto. Here the Manifesto says the peace suited these particular men themselves. In other words, they were going to get money out of it. The people, therefore, lost that peace. And again, that's exactly why Priestley is writing the play, to get the people this time to change the terms of the peace, to vote Labour and create a better future. Next, we have a definition of what socialism is. So again, the idea of the hard-faced men is repeated. They controlled the banks, so they decided how much debt you'd get into by setting interest rates. They controlled the mines and the big industries, and largely the press and the cinema. Well, the big industries is what Priestley's concerned with the factories run by the Burlings and Crofts. But it also gives us a reason, perhaps, why he's written a play, because the Labour Party perspective is that the government controls what people understand through the press, the newspapers, and the cinema. And Priestley is changing that by writing a play. It's quite interesting that Priestley had a huge radio show during the Second World War that attracted up to 16 million listeners, and the government banned it. So Priestley is used to having a massive audience to listen to his ideas, but he was perhaps thought too socialist, and his show was axed. Now, this is the very idea here in red of what socialism is against. They controlled the means by which the people's got their living. In other words, everybody's income is set by those few who are rich. And in a socialist way of life, it's the government that should be able to control that, not big business. The government should be able to set the wages that people are getting to make sure that they're fair. The reason for economic disaster, what the Manifesto calls great economic blizzards are very much like the banking crash in our own time. They were the sure and certain result of the concentration of too much economic power in the hands of too few men. And again, the Labour Party, just like Priestley, is attacking the male role in this. So when we look at it this way, we can see that Priestley's play attacks sexism and the fact that Burling and Croft think in this masculine way, where they expect to be able to get away with affairs and they expect to be able to sack women who strike for more pay when they can't afford to get another job elsewhere. And they also expect to be able to pay for sex either by meeting prostitutes at the palace bar or by finding women who are destitute, like Eva was, and putting them up in flats. And then in another stunning echo of Priestley's language, we see what the Manifesto has to say about responsibility. They had and they felt no responsibility to the nation. And this is the very heart of Priestley's play, isn't it? They're all responsible, they all had responsibility, but they felt no responsibility. And of course the tragedy at the end of the play is that Mr. and Mrs. Burling and Gerald still feel no responsibility, and that's why the Second World War is allowed to happen. They don't learn the lessons that the inspector teaches them. Now, because the war government was a coalition government, which means that no one party had a majority, so the Labour Party and the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party all had to get together. The Labour Party was able to change certain aspects. The key one that they focus on here, these interests, so the interests of the rich people, have not been able to make the same profits out of this war as they did out of the last. So rich men are no longer so powerful. They couldn't take the profit out of the war, and one of the reasons is there's 100% excess profit tax. In other words, companies that were making too much money out of the war, because, for example, they might be making millions of machine guns, or literally millions of bullets or bombs, would have to pay those profits back in tax to fund the war effort. And this allowed the government to control industry and transport. And this is a very socialist idea. The idea being that things we all need, like transport or education or health, and some industries, should earn profits for the benefit of everybody and not just for rich owners. Now, that's something we've largely lost in modern society. For example, the railways are no longer privatised, neither is gas or electricity or British Telecom and phones. But the socialist idea was very much the one that Priestley suggests. We're all responsible for each other, and therefore these kinds of industries should be run not by the Burlings and the Crofts, but by the government on behalf of the people. And it's the people that the Manifesto keeps coming back to. And then finally, the inspector's last words about us being all of one body, deliberately taking that Christian language, is echoed here in the Manifesto. So with these measures, the country has come nearer to making fair shares the national rule than ever before in its history. And this idea of fair shares is that we are all equal, and therefore we all deserve a fair amount. And that is very much the message of An Inspector Calls. If everyone had treated Eva fairly, she would not even have been sacked from the first job at Burling's. And that whole trajectory, that whole destiny, would never have begun. So another way of reading it is to see that the whole tragedy of the play is caused by that very thing. Burling's first decision not to allow Eva and her strike leaders to keep their jobs. And it's fashionable for teachers to set that question for their students. Who is most responsible for Eva's death, and looked at from the point of view of the manifesto here. The responsibility lies with the first architect of the tragedy, the person who took away the idea of fair shares, and that lays the blame fairly at Burling's feet, and by extension Gerald's, because Gerald agrees. Hopefully, looking at the manifesto this way has given you an idea of what socialism is and how to write about it, linking that to this Christian idea of us all being of one body, the feminist perspective that starts talking in the manifesto about the people, which is deliberately to include women and point out the mistakes of powerful men. Let me know if this has been useful in the comments below, and good luck.